Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Good Shabbos, my dear colleagues, and Shabbat shalom, all those who are learning with us this morning. Let's thank God for the gift of learning Torah together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. V'aretna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratav b'finu u'b'fi amcha b'Yisrael. V'niyeh אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאי עמך בית ישראל. כולנו יודעי שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה. ברוך אתה אדוני מלמד תורה לעמו ישראל. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר בחרנו מכל העמים ונתן לנו את תורתו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה. So Shabbat Shalom, dear colleagues. So eager to have this very important conversation with you this morning. I want to begin with a definition, and then a question, and then another question. The definition is a term that we've heard a lot since the murder of George Floyd, which is systemic racism or structural racism. Structural racism, systemic racism are the two concepts that are used a lot. I want to talk about a definition of that, and then I want to offer a counter to that as well, and tee up a question, which is, do you, dear clergy, do you believe our nation has a problem of systemic racism or structural racism? And based on your own moral intuitions and your own experience as American citizens, a clergy team here, 5 people. As Americans who've lived the amount that you've lived, do you think we are a racist country? That there's structural racism built into our country, or not? So here is a definition of structural racism. And it came from a movie called 13th, which refers to the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, except for it has in it a clause in the middle of the 13th Amendment that has haunted blacks in this country ever since. 2 commas and a bunch of words. 2 commas and a bunch of words have absolutely haunted the African American experience in this country, as set forth in the movie 13th. First, I'm going to read this without the clause, and then I'll read it with the clause fully. Here's without it. 13th Amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Right? That would be a nice statement. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Just a flat abolition of slavery after the Civil War. Okay. Here's what it actually says with the clause and with the words. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, comma, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So here's what structural racism or systemic racism means. It's the progeny of this clause. That is to say that at the outset of the abolition of slavery, it was never really an abolition of slavery because it came with this exception. If you're duly convicted of a crime, you are subject to heavy work, involuntary servitude. And what 13th shows, this is a film that's a click away, is that right after the 13th Amendment was passed, it became a great system in large parts of our country to arrest black people and put them to work. So from the point of view of this movie, the people who needed black labor said, well, the bad news is we don't have slavery anymore. But the good news is there's this great exception. If we can convict them of a crime, we have involuntary servitude. And what the movie 13th shows is that has created just a basic system or structure of trying to incarcerate African Americans. Now, Michelle Alexander wrote this piece that we started off with, America, This Is Your Chance. She wrote a book called The New Jim Crow, and her basic thesis is there was slavery, where blacks were owned, and then after the abolition of slavery with this clause, there were Jim Crow laws. Blacks couldn't have the same water fountains, the same buses, had to eat at the same counter, et cetera, Jim Crow laws. And when that was abolished with the Civil Rights Act, mass incarceration became the florid way to keep blacks in their place. Mass incarceration. And she argues in her piece that blacks and people of color, blacks and browns, are disproportionately incarcerated, and that America has the biggest incarceration problem, biggest incarcerated population by far of any civilized country. And it's structural or systemic because it comes from the 13th Amendment. The way to keep blacks working for whites was to incarcerate them, to convict them of a crime. Now, so just to tee up the issue, the first question is, do we have a problem? Does this country have this problem of systemic or structural racism? Now, 2 weeks ago, the Attorney General, William Barr, said there is no systemic racism in our country. And this week, the President of the United States said there is no systemic racism in our country. And he went on to say that 99.9% of police officers are great. He absolutely calls the murder of George Floyd a disgrace. But that does not mean there's systemic racism. 99.9% of the police officers in this country are great. He then revised his estimate in the speech to 99%, not 99.9% police officers are great. So there's 2 points of view. Michelle Alexander's, we have a problem, and if you see 13th, we have a problem with structural racism. The counter-narrative, no, we don't. We have a few bad actors, but police officers, bad apples, but we don't have a systemic problem. So first question is, do we have a problem? And then we'll talk about responses to the problem. Eliza, do we have a problem?
Undoubtedly. I think, listening on NPR the other day, something like 80% of the people that are currently sitting behind bars are sitting there because of misdemeanor crimes and because they are too poor to pay bail. We have a system that's designed to keep people incarcerated, a system that's designed to perpetuate poverty, and it's in the interest of the country as it currently stands to perpetuate injustice. That's how capitalism thrives.
Dan, do we have a problem of structural racism?
Yeah, I'm going to agree with Eliza and with the reading. I mean, if you had asked me this question yesterday, I would have said maybe or probably not. But then reading some of the history, and then of course I actually looked at the 13th Amendment last night as well. Yeah, the answer is I believe that we do. It's definitely structural.
Elias?
Yes, definitely.
Michelle?
So I'm going to play the humility card here and say that the answer to this question is not up to me as a human. It appears very clearly that there is systemic racism. It would be very hard to argue based on what we're seeing in our country that there's not systemic racism. On the other hand, there are, of course, factors which make it clear that although the systems may be in place, that doesn't mean that for example, all police are bad actors. I think there are, as always, many challenges that our nation has, and one of them is a profound systemic racism, and yet I'm not an expert in any of this, so what I would say is I have to learn. I have to learn more, I have to grow more, and that's why I'm excited to be part of this class, to continue to learn with each of you.
Okay, so Michelle, thank you for that, and thank all of you.
What's your opinion?
Oh, 100%. 100%. We have a huge moral stain in our country, a huge moral problem. I mean, and the interesting thing is that's a whole separate conversation and separate sermon and separate class. Why only is this awakening of people like me? Why only now is there this awakening? You know, I was listening this morning to NPR has a show about sports. It's only a game. And they were interviewing an African-American man who is a basketball coach in North Carolina. And he tells the story that he was told as a young boy to memorize your license plate, your driver's license. Memorize your driver's license because you will get stopped by police for the sin of driving while black. And when they ask you for your driver's license, if you reach in to the car to get the driver's license, your registration, very often blacks are shot dead right then and there, and the cop says, "Oh, I thought he was going for a gun," and gets off on that. So just memorize it. And he says, as a kid, this happened, and he tells the story. This is this morning's. I'm listening to this interview this morning, that he's driving his car, and he sees a policeman starts, with the sirens, and stops him, and the policeman yanks him out of the car and doesn't even ask for his registration or driver's license, and spread eagle, and starts and pulls his gun on him, and then another car comes and pulls his gun on him, and they ask him for his driver's license, and he tells it to them by memory because he had been trained for this, and the long of it all was there was somebody recognized, one of the police officers in North Carolina, which is a lot of enthusiasm for basketball. Somebody recognizes his face as a basketball coach, and then it turns out that he's also driving in the car in the back seat is a guy named Raymond Felton, who was a basketball star for North Carolina and led North Carolina to an NCAA championship. So these officers see Raymond Felton and see this guy, and then say, wait a minute, and then they go back to their cruiser and say, "Oh, it was a misunderstanding. You look like. We got a report of. You look like, namely you're black, and we got a report of." And this gentleman's testimony is that happens every day to black Americans. And in fact, he's a coach in basketball. He coaches them not only how to play basketball, but they are coached on what do you do when it will happen. And it will happen, 100% certainty that it will happen. The cops will stop you and harass you and ask you for your driver's license for the sin of looking like somebody else they were looking at, namely because for the sin of being black. So 100% this is happening.
I have
So
a
we
similar
read
story I want to share.
Yeah.
I was listening yesterday to CNN, and there was an interview. They were interviewing a retired African-American police chief, of the police force. And he was telling the story that when he was maybe 50 years ago, he was 14, he was beaten by 3 white cops. And he decided then that he wanted to be a policeman and change the force from his side. And not only he became a policer, but also he became the chief, of police. And it was very hard for him all his career. And he tells the story that as a chief police officer, he was driving his car, and he got stopped by a white cop. And the white cop never looks at his eyes, never look at him. He asks for registration with the hand here, and then he goes to the car and realizes that he has stopped the police chief officer. And it was pure, racism.
Pure racism for the sin
So-
of being black and driving while black.
Can I ask a question,
Yeah.
though? Because I think,
Right.
I'm not sure that systemic racism or not is a very generative question, because it's very clear that whether it's systemic or not systemic, and I believe it's systemic based on all the evidence that is around us, but in a sense, what matters the most is that there is very clearly profound racism that we need to respond to
Right.
in our world, and we need to be able to look through and examine and to listen and to learn so that we can upend it.
Right. So perfect segue to the question of what do we do about it, and we're clergy and a shul, so let's look at Jewish sources. So I want to just hold this question, what do we do about it, whether it's systemic racism or not, but there's clearly racism. Stories like this abound. There's so much testimony of black people being stopped for no good reason because they're black by cops, harassed, etc., and tragically ending in death. The question is, what do we do about that? And from a Jewish point of view. So hold that question, and now let's look at our sources, and then we'll plug the sources back into our question, okay? So here's, let's start with, we're on page 6. which is from Deuteronomy, which is the famous verse about justice, okay? You shall appoint magistrates and officials for your tribes in all the settlements that the Lord your God is giving you, and they shall govern the people with due justice. You shall not judge unfairly. You shall show no partiality. You shall not take bribes, for bribes blind the eyes of the discerning and upset the plea of the just. This is the key verse. Justice, justice shall you pursue, that you may thrive and occupy the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. Now, the question that our sages want to address is, why does the Torah say justice twice? No word is superfluous. Every word, every letter is there for a purpose. Why does it say justice, justice shall you pursue? Now, if you didn't look at any commentary, if you didn't have the Talmud, if you didn't look at any prophets, you were just reading this, why do you think the Torah says twice, justice, justice shall you pursue? What's the force of that repeated emphasis? If you're just
Reinforce
reading
it.
Reinforce it.
Right.
Okay, and what does reinforce mean? What does reinforce look like? Just on its face. Therefore what, Dan?
That it's not, that it's active as opposed to passive.
Active.
Yeah, when a case comes, when something comes before you, instead of waiting for something to come before you, that you actively pursue it, that you actively engage in it.
Okay, so yeah, keep going, Elisa?
I think there's also, if you look at the trope, it's a compound trope. So justice becomes an adjective on justice. That this is like the strongest kind of justice. And I think about this like balance. Like it's not as though you get to go for a static principle of justice, but you have an active working kind of a justice that's constantly balancing out and constantly titrating and making sure that it's actually enacting justice for that moment and not just a static ideal of what justice was or 100, 500 years ago or will be in the future. So
we're active and we're also evaluating what does it mean today, situationally, what does it mean today? Mm-hmm. Okay, now here's what's so interesting about this. We have rabbis on this side of the room and we have prophets on that side of the room, and they have fundamentally different orientation to this question. What we'll see, we'll look inside, is the rabbis say that the second justice is to put the brakes on the first justice, right? You might think justice means I got to be super aggressive on justice. No. The first justice is be aggressive. The second justice is be cautious and be prone to compromise, okay? That's going to be the rabbinic approach. And the prophetic approach from Isaiah is let's burn the house down if there's not justice. Literally, he's going to end on fire. Now, justice is like urgent. And if there's not justice, God can't live, you can't live. Stop with the prayers, stop with the hymns, stop with the fasting. Make the world just yesterday. And so you have two very different approaches of the rabbis, which are very incremental, and the prophets. So, Eliza, since you are a millennial, and you have a wonderful voice here, I want to ask you on page 8 to read, this is page 8 and 9 of the handout, to read the rabbis on Sanhedrin on our verse, starting with when the verse states the word righteousness twice, one mention refers to justice and one to compromise. Would you read that for us, please? Rav Ashi cites.
Rav Ashi cites support for this interpretation of the verse. Kedetanya, this is as was taught in the Baraita, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, righteousness, righteousness shall you pursue. To what does the double mention of righteousness refer?
And you could just read the English.
One refers to justice and one to compromise. How are these two approaches to be implemented? For example, if two ships are passing along a river in opposite directions, and they encounter one another in a narrow channel, if both attempt to pass at the same time, they will collide, and both will sink. If they pass through one after the other, both will pass unharmed. For this to happen, however, one must move out of the river channel to the shore until the other passes. And similarly, if two camels were ascending the narrow and very steep ascents of Beis Horon, and they encountered one another traveling in opposite directions, if both attempt to ascend and pass across the summit at the same time, both will fall. If they ascend to the summit one after the other, both will be able to ascend unharmed. How should these situations be resolved? If one boat or camel is loaded and the other is not loaded, then the one that is not loaded should give way to the one that is loaded. Or if one is close to its city and the other is not, the one that is close should give way to the one that is not close. If, however, both were equally close to their cities, or both equally far, arrange a compromise between them and let them compensate one another.
Okay, so you have the Torah saying justice, justice. What do the rabbis do to that verse here? What do they do, first of all? And then we'll talk about what you think of it.
They turn it into a very different situation than you would have imagined. I mean, it's about rite of passage in the night. It's about who has first go of it,
Okay.
rather than necessarily about justice.
Now, does anybody want to make the case for the rabbis that they're spot on here? I'll make the case if no one else. I don't want to dominate the conversation, but what can somebody be a good lawyer for the rabbis and make the case that they're just so wise right here? Anyone?
Well,
Dan?
in this particular situation, they're wise. I mean, but I think as Elisa stated, they've taken a broad statement, and what they do oftentimes is make it narrow, which is, but I think they're missing the point.
You think they're missing the point?
I think they're missing the point. So I'm not. I mean,
I think they're nailing the point. Why do you think they're missing the point?
Because this. It's just too narrow an instance, and I think that the broad implication here is not about broad justice for the needy, for the poor. It's about something. I think it's about something different.
So I read a beautiful. Can I say?
Yeah, please.
I read a beautiful article, really poignant and profound, about how many times we've been here before, and real change has not happened. There's been passion, there's been fire, there have been protests, and it kind of fizzled out. The prophetic voice, as you have pointed out many times in these classes, often fails because people run out of energy for the prophetic voice. It's tough to be living always here. Always,
Right.
We've got to tear down everything. We've got to destroy. We've got to rebuild. We've got to, people have a hard time maintaining that. And the rabbinic voice here is, you know what? If we can kind of work together towards possibilities, towards maybe incremental changes, towards, look, I see, it would be really helpful to you over there if we change this thing so that you can move along your path unmolested. Maybe, for example, you're looking at all the examples that people are pulling up about the Camden Police Department, right? Dismantle, dismantle, dismantle. Maybe actually there's a role for police being a little bit different in their roles. It's not a full dismantlement, as I understand it, although I'm not an expert on that.
Yeah.
There's more police
There's more
presence,
police in Camden,
but
yeah.
it's police who actually are trying to care about you, who are seeing you, who are working with you. Maybe there are other options and models where we can each go on the path, whoever the each is in this case, with a spirit of moving forward in some manner of peace towards that arc of justice.
Elias?
So several things here. If you read Michelle, the article of Michelle, the other Michelle, Michelle Alexander, she says that these slow incremental changes haven't worked. There are no results with it. And they try all kind of things, all kind of different things. I'm usually a person who likes slow changes and not radical changes, but I'm not so sure in this case will happen. And the second thing is regarding the tzedek stuff that we are reading. I think you mentioned last week or 2 weeks ago about that during the government of President Obama, there were also a few cases like this, and the policemen who did the same kind of acts are not in jail. Yeah. And the question is more like, for example, just to give you an example, what would have happened if a black police officer kills a white person and then he's brought to justice? Will he be in jail or not? So the question is not so much about if justice is well done here, or how we apply the justice,
Right.
and that, are we judging people with the same eyes?
Great. So I think I want to bring this together to a point. Note the move here. The Torah gives us a broad directive: justice, justice shall you pursue. And the problem is that the real world is a messy, gritty place. And I think it's worth pausing on the two contexts that the Talmud tries to graft this airy language into. And both are places of narrowness and danger, right? Ships in a narrow pass. It's a place of narrowness and danger. Two camels ascending a mountain. It's a place of narrowness and danger. The world is the world is a place of narrowness and danger. And what else is it about the Talmud's piece? That there's not one point of view, there's 2 points of view. And they're like this, right? So you have 2 points of view like this, and you have narrowness and you have danger. So when you leave the academy, or you leave the synagogue, or you leave the chapel, and you go into the gritty world, what you find is people with multiple points of view, rallies and counter-rallies, and you find danger and so forth. So the rabbis here are saying that if you want to live together in a society in peace, you need justice and you need compromise so both sides can work their way through it. Eliza, is a general proposition, we'll take racism out for a second, but as a general proposition, what do you think of that posture?
So as long as both points of view are valid, I'm on board. But the challenge that I experience with this text in our world today is I don't experience both points of view as being valid. And I don't see, right, in both of these cases, both parties are equally endangered. And that, I think, allows you to take this perspective of justice and compromise. When both parties are equally affected by the situation, that's one way to affect justice. But when one party is significantly more endangered than the other, when one party is significantly more privileged than the other, this just doesn't feel applicable to me.
Just to play devil's advocate, okay? And I've been listening to both sides of it, right? Police will say, how could you judge us? Do you know that we regularly put our lives on the line? Do you know that cops are killed doing their job every day in this country? That never makes the news. Cops who are killed doing their job every day. There are actually criminals in this world. There are actually people who mean ill. And when your home is invaded, you call 911 and you want a cop there. And so they will say that. I mean, I was listening to a testimony of a New York officer this morning who says that there are hundreds of thousands of interactions between police and citizens every day that are unremarkable, where they're doing their job very well, ensuring the public safety, and, by the way, risking their life while doing it. So
Totally.
Is it the case that only one side is endangered?
So I would then look at all developed countries in the world, and if all developed countries had the same rates of police brutality, then I would say, you know what, the police are totally right here, they're equally endangered, their perspective matters, and I don't want to minimize, they are putting their lives at risk. But the fact that the United States has the highest incidence of police gun violence of other developed nations, that says something about both points not being equal, right? If Norway and Canada and Great Britain and all these other countries, if they can lower their violence lower their state-sanctioned violence without
Right.
increasing public violence, then I would say that that's not the case here. That it's probably a function of lack of education, of lack of resources, of not applying the right resources to the right problems. And we really have an issue here that's not about police lives being endangered.
Okay, so from your point of view, and to build on Elias's intuition as well, this kind of move forward and compromise, which leads to a certain incrementalism, does not actually advance the cause. And as Elias pointed out, and Michelle Alexander writes, that the Minneapolis Police Department actually embodied a lot of the progressive thinking, anger management, sensitivity training, reconciliation, not being warriors but being partners. And they did all that, and still George Floyd was murdered, suggesting that the rabbi's caution doesn't actually get you where you need to go. So let's turn to Isaiah and whether Isaiah's fire could get us where we need to go. This is Isaiah chapter 1. And come, page 13 of the handout. Come, let us reach an understanding, says the Lord. Be your sins like crimson, they can turn snow white. Be they red as dyed wool, they can become like fleece. If then you agree and give heed, you will eat the good things of the earth, but if you refuse and disobey, you will be devoured by the sword, for it was the Lord who spoke. So what you have here is not incrementalism. You have, I would say, black and white, but I'll use the color scheme of the prophet, red and white. And actually, this is language that is borrowed for the High Holiday Machzor, that there's red, which is sinful, bad blood, and white, which is clean, clear, and pure. No incremental, okay? Alas, she has become a harlot. Understatement is not a prophetic tool. Understatement is not what they do. Right? She has become a harlot, the faithful city that was filled with justice, where righteousness dwelt, but now murderers. Your silver has turned to dross, your wine is cut with water, your rulers are rogues and cronies of thieves, everyone avid for presents and greedy for gifts. They do not judge the case of the orphan, and the widow's cause never reaches them. And then God doesn't like that very much. Assuredly, this is the declaration of the sovereign, the Lord of hosts, the mighty one of Israel. I will get satisfaction from my foes. I will wreak vengeance on my enemies. I will turn my hand against you, smelt out your dross as with lye, remove all your slag. I will restore magistrates as of old, and your counselors as of yore. After that you shall be called city of the righteousness, faithful city. Zion shall be saved in judgment, her repentant ones in the retribution, but rebels and sinners shall all be crushed, and those who forsake the Lord shall perish. So there's no gray zone here. There's no compromise. There's justice, and you're going to be fine, and unjust, and you're going to be crushed. And then here's how it ends. It ends with fire. Truly, you shall be shamed, those who forsake God, because of the terebinths you desired, and you shall be confounded because of the gardens you coveted. For you shall be like a terebinth, wilted of leaf, and like a garden that has no water. Stored wealth shall become as tow, and he who amassed it a spark, and the two shall burn together with none to quench. It ends in a fire, right? So here you have no incremental, you have radical. There's unjust, which ends up burning, or there is a city of faithfulness and justice. And my question is, does that, I'll come back to you, Lisa, is that prism a helpful prism today, this prophetic prism? I can't tolerate unjust. I can't tolerate this. Our country's on fire. We have to fix this now. We have to do the most radical changes possible now. Is Isaiah's lens helpful?
I think so, and I think it's important to note Isaiah is speaking, he's not speaking to the oppressed, he's not speaking to the people that are suffering from discrimination, he's speaking to the people in power and in privilege. And those are the people who are not likely to feel their own privilege, their own power, who are not likely to be upset with the status quo, and so I think it's a really helpful framework to them.
Now, Michelle, you had earlier voiced some caution about the staying power of this. Do you find this prism helpful?
This prism is tremendously helpful, clearly, right? And things have happened in the last few weeks that should have happened, 50 years ago and have not happened. So clearly there's a power in that sense of passion and in that sense of fury. That, as Dan has been saying for weeks and weeks, right? It's the only thing that changes the world, and there are definitely times where that is absolutely true. You need the prophetic voice. And you're not going to be surprised to hear me say this. And you need the rabbinic voice. And I don't think the rabbinic voice is a voice of incrementalism in terms of, well, let's just wait. I think that's a misinterpretation. They're not saying, oh, be patient and, wait on this. What they're saying is that there are real problems. The way that I see justice is not always the way that you're going to see justice.
Right.
And I think we have to understand that there's justice in some way means justice for me and justice for you. And that means we got to talk to each other. We've got to learn from each other. And we've got to understand where's your passage and where's my passage. And that doesn't always happen out on the streets.
So speaking more radically, I mean, not radically, applying to the cops that killed George Floyd, if they are not going to get convicted, a lot of people are going to say justice was done because he was dangerous. You know, in many cases they say, you know, they are free because, you know, he was a dangerous person and he was ready to kill as the policeman. And
that's historically how white cops who kill black people get off.
So the understanding of justice, you know, it's complex. The justice is a big word.
I mean, you're pointing to it's hard for most people in the world to see George Floyd's murder as in any way just, or that he was a threat. But take for example, you know, there are ways in which, as Elisa has pointed out, when one part of society is able to have privilege and is able to feel comfortable and is able to feel like their slice of the world is working. It's a zero-sum game sometimes. And the rabbis actually, justice means we can't actually tolerate, I mean, I'm going to interpret them a little here, but it's not okay to tolerate that zero-sum game. We can't be in this place where only I win and only you lose. We've actually got to find a way to reshift the deck, to move it so that actually we both can find justice.
How would you do that?
That's a hard process.
Dan?
So I want to just actually just go to the Heschel for a second.
Please.
On page 10.
Yes.
Where he, and this actually also relates to what we just read from the prophets. So we just read about, about God's wreaking vengeance.
Right.
And it talks about this, it's really quite violent. And then we have this kind of like systemic violence that's going on. And then if you go to the Heschel on page 10, Heschel talks about human violence is interminable, unbearable, and permanent. That's his statement. So we have this. So it's the idea. It seems like violence begets violence, and violence sometimes is the voice of God through the prophet. And that I find that very disconcerting, because it doesn't. What Michelle was just saying was so beautiful. We have to that space, that narrow hair between you and me. In finding the talking points, right? That we're not finding, the idea that Shekhinah is between two people, right? We're not the Shekhinah. We're not finding the Shekhinah. We're not finding that space. Right. So the idea that that when God promises, according to the prophet, to find a place for justice, it's through the only thing that humans seem to understand, which is violence, which
Wes,
right.
in some ways.
I need to say something.
Yes.
So in order to clarify a little bit more what I said before, I have a lot of experience in growing up in countries that are not developed as America and Canada and other countries. And usually these countries, especially in South America and many parts of the world, they go from military governments. In the case of Argentina, they disappeared 30,000 people because they just didn't like it. They thought they were all socialist and communist. And even if you were a friend of them, they would make you disappear. No justice, nothing. Or governments that are democratically elected, but they are very left-wing, very left-wing. So in those cases, in many countries now, the police officer, the police force don't have any impact in regular day society. So for example, there are strikes during the day, and the police cannot separate them and put them on the sidewalk like many times we see here. They cut all the streets, so for the regular driver who wants to go to work, you cannot get there because the people who are doing riots, they are in the middle of this. And without many examples. So the point is that in those cases, you don't get a good living as a police officer.
Right.
They take the bribes that Shoftim says do not do that. And they become part of the big problem. So if you talk about defunding the police, all right, let's examine that, but let's not get to the extreme where if you are touched by a police cop, like in many countries happen,
right.
It's a whole whole thing and whole, crisis and
Right.
anarchy in the country.
Can I raise one other aspect?
Yes.
It feels really important to name, I think our conversation thus far has really centered on police brutality and racism as it erupts in our criminal justice system. But there are subtle and insidious ways that racism is alive in our country that we don't always talk about. For instance, the number of black people that we see in news broadcasts and in radio and in movies and in TV shows, the number of black people that are unable to rise. I'm reading right now White Fragility, and Christine D'Angelo makes a really important point that we often talk about the first black baseball player, the first black basketball player, the first black person that was able to do this, instead of saying the first black person that we allowed to emerge as into that role, that we have a world very much like the Orthodox world in Israel, where women are erased from the pages of magazines because of tznius, because you don't want to see them, because only men are allowed to take public sphere roles. We've created that. And so visually, the text here with the boats and the camels, everybody has been seeing equally. And I think that we have to talk not just about violence and about systemic racism that affects people's physical safety, but also their vision of their own potential to move forward, and also our vision of what our world looks like. Because we're not, Michelle, to your point, we're actually not seeing each other. We actually see just a white world, particularly here at Temple Manual, we are super white, and we don't see the diversity that exists in Boston, and we don't see the diversity that should exist here, and we're not fighting against it. We're sort of okay with that status quo. We have to get to the place where we see each other.
So what I hear you saying, Eliza, is that in fact, there is a place both for the prophetic voice and the rabbinic voice, because the prophetic voice lights the fire, the urgency. The rabbinic voice lets us see all of the players, all of the complexity. And President Obama said politics is the art of compromise. And that's really what this text from the Talmud is saying. The politics is the art of compromise, so you can both get in. So you need prophetic to light a fire, you need rabbinic to see complexity and to work through subtlety and nuance. So here's how I would like to end this class. I think that the folks who are protesting have done a really good job of lighting a fire. But I think that the language of the conversation is unfortunate. So I think the language of dismantle, abolish, defund, disband is unfortunate, because that is not nuanced language, and it leaves you painted into a corner. If you don't want that, then where do you go from there? It doesn't allow you to work through the past with somebody of opposing point of view. And what I have found helpful this week, as I've been listening to broadcasts and reading up about it, is that the real conversation happening on Congress and in different state houses is much more nuanced. It is, can we reallocate money that used to go to police for mental health? Can we reallocate money so that issues of mental health and mental illness are not dealt with by police, but by mental health professionals and counselors who will be on the streets? Can we do some practical things like not have no-knock arrests, warrants, where police can just go in? That's what happened with Breonna Taylor in Louisville. They just barged it through the door. Can we get rid of that? Can we encourage officers to do more citations instead of arrests? Because to your point, and Michelle Alexander brings us up, that so many arrests are on low-level crimes, like selling a loose cigarette, which Eric Garner did, or counterfeit bill, which was the issue with George Floyd. And instead of arresting, which creates that whole cycle of police, could there be citations instead? And then ultimately, accountability. Can officers be accountable for their actions? All of those steps, accountability, no-knock warrants, citations, reallocation, getting more mental health, right? All of that is not dismantle. All of that is not disband. All of that is not defund. All of that is more nuanced. And in fact, Michelle mentioned the Camden Police Department. As a result of the changes in Camden, NPR, of course, had a segment on that as well. They did a number of those nuanced steps. There's more police on the streets than fewer. My hope for our country is that we recognize that we have a problem. And I think what's special about this moment is that there is a broad emerging consensus that we have a problem of structural racism, that the child of the 13th Amendment was a propensity to arrest and incarcerate black people, and that the aftergrowth of slavery was Jim Crow, the aftergrowth of Jim Crow was mass incarceration, and that for the first time, our nation as a whole, broad consensus, not uniform by any standard, by any measure, but a lot of people are recognizing that we have a problem of structural racism, and I hope that we can bring both the prophetic insistence that this is an urgent problem that must be dealt with and not let that urgency fizzle away, and the rabbinic gift of seeing complexity and recognizing difference and taking measured steps. We need all of that to
So
really
who wins?
fulfill justice.
Rabbis or prophets?
We need them both.
The answer.
We need them both. And maybe that's why we have justice shall you pursue. One comes from rabbinic insistence, one comes from prophetic
I
passion.
think we all want slow changes, but there are answers that need to be,
Right.
changes that need to be done quickly, because there are a lot of people suffering.
Yeah, yeah. Elias, do you have a song?
Yes,
This is a beautiful
so
song.
this is a beautiful song called Make It a Bridge by New York composer Stephen Meltzer. And it's just to read, in case you don't understand what we are saying, just to read a little bit the lyrics. There is a wall standing between us, a wall so tall we shout to be heard. If we come near with lower voices, we can pierce the wall and make it a bridge. Kol ha'olam kulo. Colleagues? There is a wall standing between us, a wall so tall we shout to be heard. If we come near with lower voices, we can pierce the wall and make it a bridge. Kol ha'olam kulo, gesher tzar me'od, ve'ha'ikar lo nefached lav. Kol ha'olam kulo, gesher tzar me'od, ve'ha'ikar lo nefached lav. There is a wall standing between us, a wall so thick that pounding just won't do. If we move close and touch it gently, we can part the wall and make it a bridge. Kol ha'olam kulo, gesher tzar me'od, ve'ha'ikar lo nefached lav. Kol ha'olam kulo, gesher tzar me'od, ve'ha'ikar lo nefached lav.
Thank you, and thank you. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom, everybody. Thank you.